Let's get straight to your questions now, if we can. And we're going to start with this one from John B, who also says he loves the weekly Q&A, which is nice to hear. Thank you for that, John. We appreciate that. Michael, if you were at the negotiating table, what would be the top 3 things you would ask for?
On Ukraine's behalf? Yes, if I was representing Ukraine, it's fairly clear. I guess one is you want security guarantees. So if there is to be a truce in which Ukraine is going to agree, at least temporarily, to give up 20% of its territory, and by temporary I mean 30 or 40 years, but not forever. If we're going to give up that territory for now, then I would want security guarantees for what we are going to hold on to. Secondly, I'd want some guarantees of independence, that we will be allowed as a country to make our own way democratically, to become whatever we want to be without external interference, or to have a guarantee that we'll be no more interfered with than any other countries in Europe, all of whom are suffering foreign interference at the moment. So I think I guess that's the second thing. And the third thing I would want would be the recognition that Ukraine, the Ukrainian leader, have a right to military aid from my friends. That my friends, if the West Europeans are prepared to support me militarily, it's entirely my right to have them do that on my territory with my agreement. Exactly as Russia can have its friends in North Korea give it support, or Iran in Tehran to give it support from Iran, if they ask for it and the Iranians want to give it. I would want the same right as the Russians have to get support from its friends, to be militarily strong against an uncertain future. So if I was representing Ukraine, that would be it, I think. It would be a security guarantee, a guarantee of my political independence, and a guarantee that I could receive military help if I asked for it and my friends in Europe wanted to offer it.
We don't seem unreasonable for a sovereign state, but of course there are states in war. What have the Russians said? Because they have maximalist demands, don't they, as to what, if they would even accept a peace deal, but they've already made it quite clear that some of those things are just non-starters for them.
Yes, I mean, the Russian demands are that Ukraine would not be a proper sovereign state, because they've never accepted since 1991 that Ukraine really is a sovereign state. But remember, Ukraine has exactly the same legitimacy as Russia itself. Both of them were established as what were known as successor states to the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 15 new states were created, 15 out of the old Soviet Union. One of them was Russia, the Russian Federation. Another was Ukraine. Others were the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia. I mean, all the stands, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and so on. 15 new states. Every one of them has the same legitimacy as the other 14. So, yeah, the Russians are now saying that this particular state, Ukraine, as one of the successor states, is not a proper state. Well, they've got no legal basis to say that, and no historical basis to say it either, despite all the things that Putin says about this mystical past. What he forgets is Kiev was established in the year 482. 482. Moscow wasn't established until the 12th century.
I love getting the history lesson from you, Michael. Can you do the Putin's mystical past history lesson, but briefly?
Briefly. The mystical past is that the Russians have a mystical mission in world politics. And some of this is mysticism. I mean, we believe he consults shamans, along with his friend Shogu, the previous defense minister, that they have a sense that the Russian people are the people who unite the Slavic world. And the Slavic world is a cradle of real civilization. And Western civilization is sold out to a complete sort of mistake. It's gone the wrong way.
Well, talk about it being decadent, the decadent Western.
Yes, completely decadent. Whereas Slavic civilization is true, proper Christian, Eastern Orthodox civilization, and that is a role that history has, as it were, accorded to the Russian people as presently expressed in the Federation of Russia. It's all rubbish. It's rubbish. But they believe it. Believe me, and there are people around Putin who really believe it and write about it all the time.
And there are strands of some of it, aren't there? This Novorossiya, what is that idea that you talked about?
Novorossiya is the name that is given to the empire of Catherine the Great. And Catherine the Great's empire covered most of the area now that the Russians are fighting over in the Donbass and southern Ukraine through to Odessa, Moldova, and it was always called Novorossiya, New Russia. And of course, the Ukrainians were always called Little Russians. They were never accorded proper status within Russia because they are ethnically different. And so what the Russians say is that on the one hand, they're the same as us, but on the other hand, they're not the same as us because they're a minor people. They're inferior because they're only Little Russians, they're only Ukrainians. It's a real double standard. So, yeah, Novorossiya is the Catherine the Great empire that Putin has made no secret of the fact that he'd like to recreate. And the phrase Novorossiya has started to, it's reappeared very recently in the Russian press. As they've been talking about ceasefires in this last month, Novorossiya crops up in the Russian press all the time. It's a phrase that they're beginning to get into public debate again, in the West as well as in their own country.
Yeah, this just pulls at strands of things that have some truth and then mixes in some of that mysticism, some of that nonsense as well that are his reasons for invading his neighbour. Let's move on to the question from M. McGill, who asks, have the so-called peace negotiations changed anything at all in Ukraine? The attacks just seem to be increasing.
Yeah, I mean, that is the case. The war is going on pretty much as it was. The only part of the ceasefires which has partially come into operation is no long-range attacks on energy facilities. So the Ukrainians have continued long-range attacks on military bases in Russia, but they've not attacked, I think, in the last week or 10 days, any of the oil refineries with long-range weapons. The Russians are not attacking Ukrainian energy facilities with long-range weapons, but they're attacking them with short-range weapons.
I was going to say, because they're attacking
so in Kherson, they've used artillery. So, yeah, I mean, Ukrainian energy facilities are still being attacked, but not with long-range weapons because the Russians are close enough to some of them to use short-range weapons, which is what they're doing. So there is one very limited part of the ceasefire deal. You know, this whole ceasefire deal is going to be land, sea and air. Well, no, it's only in the air. And of the air, it's only in one little element of the air. And of that element in the air, it's only a restriction on which weapons. And it doesn't prevent the Russians hitting them. It does prevent some of the Ukrainian weapons being used.
Was there a sort of a decrease, a slowdown in drone attacks a couple of nights ago? I think some of the reporting suggests
yes, there was.
That might have been.
And that may be more to do with capabilities than anything else. The Russians have brought an enormous number of drones forward in the last 2 weeks or so. And so they've been mounting huge attacks, which have dropped off a little bit. I suspect that's more to do with the phasing of the planning of the operations rather than any political decision. But we don't know. It may play into negotiations which are still going on between the American team and the Russian team.
And just to remind everyone, if you want to submit questions while we're going along, you can do in the comments, but I didn't say that at the top. My apologies for that. Let's move on to this question here from Ben. This is about the tariffs you and I were talking about a little bit before this started. How could Trump tariffs work against Russia? What exactly would he need to do for them to work?
Well, the short answer is not very much. There's not much they can do, partly because, Russia is the most highly sanctioned country in the world by quite a long way, that American-Russian trade is now very low. It became very low after the 22 invasion. So it's now, last time I looked, it was down to about less than 5 billion each side. I think it was like 3.5 to 4 billion trade going backwards and forwards, dollars. So it's very low, and it's down to the level it was during the Cold War when the Soviet Union was basically frozen out of the Western system altogether. So there isn't much trade that could be sanctioned as such. What President Trump could do, which both of which would be very effective, one is that he could help to engineer a decrease in the price of oil by putting more American stuff on the market, persuading the Saudis to bring their stuff forward. Price of oil is edging downwards, so the marker price for oil, I mean, there's lots of different prices, but the price we look at, the price that sets the others, it's around about $80 a barrel at the moment.
Right.
It's been up to 100, 120. It's now down to about 80, which is still quite high, but it's not intolerable. It has been as low as 30 in the past. If that price came down from 80 to about 50, then the Russians would be in serious trouble because they get so much of their income from oil. So one thing that President Trump might want to do, for his own benefit as well, is engineer a drop in the price of oil, which he can have some effect on. The second thing is, although direct sanctions on Russia wouldn't have so much effect, secondary sanctions, which he has threatened, could have a big effect, to say that we, the Americans, will sanction any company or country that deals with Russia on other issues. Now, that's something that really worries the Russians. It really worries the Chinese. It's a very serious thing to do because it's a massive restraint on trade. But here we are. We're in the world of massive restraints on trade. The free trading system is collapsed now as of today. So maybe it's possible. So technically, a threat of secondary sanctions, which would hurt people trading with Russia on other things, that would be effective.
You're our military analyst, but can you be our economic analyst as well, just for a second? On the oil thing, if Trump were to do that, I mean, gas prices in the United States would go down if the price of oil's cheaper.
Yes, it would. And gas in the United States is pretty cheap because of the fracking revolution. I mean, the US has completely turned and this is over the last 10, 15 years, it's turned the energy market on its head because of the fracking revolution. I mean, Trump, in one sense, is not wrong when he says drill, baby, drill. Frack, baby, frack is the answer, because their ability to create gas out of fracking has turned that market on its head. And that's affected the oil market as well. So in general, I mean, America has much more power, physical power, over the price of oil and gas than it ever used to have in the past. And most of the oil coming out of the Middle East, I mean, everyone used to say, look, the Americans are interested in the Middle East because of all the oil they needed. And that was sort of true in the 50s, 60s, but only sort of. But now that's not the case. I mean, as I say, most of the tankers coming out of the Gulf now from the Middle East, they turn left, not right. They go to Asia. They don't come to the West. They're going to Asia. It's the Asian market that really needs the oil that they're producing.
Let's move on to some more questions about the war. Jake H., who is watching along with us now in the comments, has said, are there Russian weapons that Ukraine and the West are unable to stop?
Yes, there are. Ballistic missiles are very difficult to stop. They're not impossible, but you need the best sort of air defense systems to bring down a ballistic missile, such as Patriot or the Arrow 2 that the Israelis have got. I mean, it can be done. But ballistic missiles, because they drop from a great height and are very fast, are really hard to target and stop. And you can't get at them until they start their final descent, generally speaking. The other missiles that are almost impossible to stop at the moment are hypersonic missiles, which both the Russians and the Chinese are developing. The Russians have got some.
We haven't seen them until this war, hypersonic.
No, that's right. We haven't seen them used. And, I mean, the Americans are developing them as well. The British, are looking at developing them or sharing development of them as well. This is the new threshold, I'm afraid, in ballistic missile use. And hypersonic missiles are missiles that are so fast that they can move at 5 to 8 times the speed of sound. That makes them very, very difficult to shoot down. But also, the Russians have developed missiles and the Chinese are developing missiles that they don't just take off and go on a flight path that you can see and then come down at you. They can take off and circle round and then release their missile at a time that you may or may not have expected.
Almost like a loitering missile.
Exactly. So the vehicle loiters and then it launches its hypersonic missile at the time that it chooses. That's almost impossible to defend against. And so when you're talking about dealing with those, you can only really deal with them at the moment by a small degree of defense, defend what you can, but essentially you've got to deter. You've got to be able to say, if you use those weapons, then we have weapons either the same or worse or different weapons that we would use. Or, I mean, they may not be weapons. There might be leverage on what we'll do or what we won't do. And so when you're up against a weapon that is hard to defend against, you're really thrown back on either goodwill, that it won't be used, and trust your luck, or deterrence. Or some mixture of the two.
What's this war taught us about the possibility of missile exchange and how that would play out? Are we matched with the Russians? Are we overmatched? Where do we stand?
In what sort of missiles, Kamali?
Well, in terms of ballistic missiles, if there was to be an exchange.
Oh, I mean, the West.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the United States has got a fair stock of ballistic missiles, but the Russians have, by and large, got more, and they've got far, far more than the Europeans. I mean, the Europeans have not gone in for ballistic missile developments because we left it to the Americans, and we certainly won't be able to do that in the future. So ballistic missiles are something we will probably develop more of, but it's not a question of matching Russian stocks. It's matching their strategy so that any use of ballistic missiles wouldn't be worthwhile, and we have some sort of deterrent against them. And of course, I hate to keep saying this, but our ultimate ballistic missile deterrent in the United Kingdom is our Trident missiles sitting on a submarine somewhere under the North Atlantic. As we speak, there is a British submarine with 8 missiles on board, 8 ballistic missiles, which would carry 40 warheads.
Mm-hmm. And quick thought, we are upgrading that Trident system, right?
We are to a Dreadnought, yes. I mean, that won't appear till the early 2030s. And the present Trident system, the Vanguard boats, are creaking a bit, I have to say. I mean, they've been in service a good 10 years longer than they should have been, which is not a great thing. But the fact is they work. Nobody should doubt that they work. And if the order were given, these missiles would fire, and that is the ultimate deterrent. It's a nuclear deterrent. It's not comfortable to talk about it or even to think about it, but there it is. That's the technological truth.
It's necessary, isn't it? And that's where the Prime Minister and John Healey went not long ago to be on the boat.
To Barrow. That's right, to talk about the new dreadnought boat. The keel was being laid down, the first cutting, as they say, for the first dreadnought boat, yeah.
William Kay has a question here. Why is there such a huge difference between the figures for Russian soldiers' deaths from Ukraine, the MOD, and the United States? What is your best guess for the true number of Russian deaths? Do we?
Yeah, there are lots of figures. What I would say is that if you want to check out, have a look at the Wikipedia page on it. Just put into Wikipedia.
I never thought I'd hear a professor look at Wikipedia.
Absolutely. I'm a great supporter of Wikipedia. I mean, you've got to be careful what you look at. But if you look at dates and places, and it's not right all the time, but its level of inaccuracy is less than that of Encyclopedia Britannica.
Wow.
It turns out, when it's been tested, yeah. Yep. So anyway, Wikipedia is pretty good on that sort of thing, and it just gives you a list there of all the different estimates that have come out from about 10 or 12 different sources, Russian sources, Ukrainian sources, independent sources. Our own Ministry of Defence, their figures are quite good, not because they're the British MOD, but because they draw their figures from Defence Intelligence, and the Defence Intelligence Organisation in MOD is very good, and it's very big. It's Army, Navy, Air Force intelligence together, all contributing to what's known as DI, Defence Intelligence. And their figures are conservative and reliable, I think. And they look at all sources plus their own intelligence estimates. So the real figures seem to be something like 750 to 800,000 Russian casualties, going towards 1 million. Now, by casualties, we mean dead and wounded. And by wounded, we mean seriously wounded. Mm-hmm. Seriously enough to take you off the battlefield, not sort of to be patched up and go back the following day. So people who've, lost an arm, a leg, or, serious head injuries, something like that. It's a wound that takes you off the battlefield. So total casualties, it looks like 250 to 300,000 Russian dead and another 400,000, 450,000 seriously wounded. And it might be more than that. By some estimates, it's going beyond the 1 million as we speak, the dead and wounded. Ukrainian casualties look as if they are between half of that and maybe up to 2/3 of that, maybe. But funny enough, they're harder to estimate because the Ukrainians are so secretive about it for understandable reasons, to be honest.
Michael, put that into context for us, if you can. 3 and a bit years of war now, and those numbers.
Oh, it's far and away the most casualties the Russians have suffered. I mean, they suffered, 60,000, I think it was 60 to 50,000 casualties in Afghanistan over a 10-year period. For 8-year period, from 1979 to 1988. And so it's 10 times, more than 10 times more than Afghan casualties. The Americans suffered just over 60,000 casualties in Vietnam, again over a period of 10 years, 1964 to 1973. So we're talking about 10 times greater than the casualties of the big wars that both Russia and the United States have fought. And these are, you're getting towards Second World War levels of casualties on the battlefield, where you're looking at 1 in 5 soldiers being killed or seriously wounded within 6 or 8 months of being deployed. And those are Second World War levels.
Do we have a number of civilian casualties as well?
There are. They're much lower. I mean, confirmed. Mm-hmm. But in Russia, it's fairly small. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about some hundreds. In Ukraine, you're talking about tens of thousands, but the low tens of thousands that are confirmed.
Is that surprising, considering how brutal this war has been?
Yeah, I mean, lots of destruction of buildings, lots and lots of injuries, not as many deaths, but certainly there have been more than there should have been. That's for sure.
Absolutely. All right. On that, then, Mike D asks, how does Putin explain away the loss of those Russian soldiers while at the same time looking to conscript a further 160,000? The biggest conscription they've done, isn't it, to this point?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, that was announced, I think it was this week, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The conscription is normally twice a year in Russia, and the figure was always 132,000 twice a year that they conscript into the forces. And it was never remotely near 130,000 because so many people bought themselves out. They fiddled the system. The recruiters were given a figure to recruit, and at the end of the period, they hadn't recruited the figure. So nobody ever thought that the Russians really recruited 130,000 a year. But since this war started in 2022, this phase of the war, they've tightened up on conscription, and now they've gone up from 130, 132 to 160,000 this year. Remember also that Putin mobilized what he called his partial mobilization in the autumn of 2022, 300,000. And that was very unpopular. And the Russians really don't want to do that again because it was really unpopular and it was destabilizing even his hold on power at the time. So they're trying to rely on conscription at a higher level. And they probably will get something close to the 160,000 now because they're being very draconian about that. But they really rely on voluntary enlistment among the eastern peoples in Buryat and in parts of the Siberian oblasts, the regions, and a lot of foreign troops. And they're paying them huge amounts. I mean, the signing on bonus plus the level of pay. And there are lots of stories from some of the eastern provinces. I mean, it's almost, it's very affecting in its way. The whole family turns up when father goes to sign up. And father is, 38, 39, 40. And with the signing up bonus they get, then his son and his young wife are going to be able to get a flat, and his wife's going to be able to get a car, and they all celebrate the sacrifice father is making while he goes off to get himself killed or wounded somewhere on the front. It's astonishing, but the amount of money that they're offering now as bonuses and pay is life-changing for some of these poorer families in the eastern provinces.
Well, I'm just finding those stories now because the what do you call it, bounty, the compensation that's paid when some of these soldiers die is huge. And you say it's changed entire villages where, families suddenly have enough money to be able to support themselves.
Family could go on holiday and buy a big car because father's dead. I mean, it sounds ridiculous when you say it. And there is some resentment about that. They said, there's women driving around in big cars now because their husband died. And that, I'm sure, is nasty gossip. But it is socially disruptive because the Russians are buying the loyalty of the citizens that they want, plus the loyalty of a lot of foreign citizens from African countries, from other Asian countries. Many of them sign on thinking that they're coming to do logistics at very high rates of pay, just behind the lines work, or even construction work, and find themselves on the front lines. And then they can't get out because their passports have been taken and they're subject to military discipline. Lots and lots of stories like that. The Ukrainians are not above doing some of these things, but nothing like to the same extent or the same brutality. The Ukrainians have been pretty tough in their recruitment as well because they're so short of people. But the Russians, on the basis of their normal recruitment, could not sustain these numbers unless they played these sorts of games.
It's reported that soldiers' families get 5 million rubles, about $54,000 when they're killed, and then it will get non-specified further monthly payments. So, literally life-changing for those families. And the Ukrainians, there's been some criticism, hasn't there, about the Ukrainians and their way of calling up soldiers because they've left some cohorts out that they haven't wanted to bring into the army.
They have, and the Ukrainians' problem is that their recruitment age was 28. You had to be over 28 to go because the idea was that young people shouldn't have to go to fight wars. They're the lifeblood of the future. You can understand their thinking. It's completely opposite to our thinking, of course, where we send our young people to war because they're the ones who are best able to do it. But they've since reduced it very controversially to 25. I think, is it 25? I think it's 25, not 26.
Check for you, Michael. Go on. I
might be wrong about that. It might be it's 26. But anyway, the argument, and a lot of the Americans who are so sceptical about Ukraine have said, look, you've got to bring this down to your younger people, and they've got to be prepared to go and fight for the country they want. And that goes round and round. It's very unpopular in the Ukrainian parliament. But it is an issue that the Ukrainians are accused of not mobilizing as fully as they should if they're really fighting for their lives, which of course they are.
Yes, age of 25.
25 it is now, yeah. Okay.
All right, let's move on to some of the questions we've got coming in from the comments. Thank you very much for that. Robert B. asks, what is the latest on the US-Ukraine minerals deal? Remember that? Is this still part of the peace talks? Robert asks, and also he gives you props for such a good Q&A, Michael, as well.
Yeah, it's not part of the peace talks as such, but it's certainly related to it. The latest Ukrainian minerals deal is now extortion, really. The United States keeps changing the terms of it. And what Zelensky thought he had a deal to go and sign, which was that awful time he had in the White House, 4 weeks ago now, and that was the deal they were going to sign. Now the Americans have toughened it up. So what they're saying is that, they want a fund, an investment fund that both Ukraine would pay into and the United States would have 50% of it, Ukraine would have 50% of it. But the US has control of this fund. It would appoint 3 of the 5 board members. Nobody else would be, the Ukrainians would not be allowed to sell anything else to anyone else, like any other country. And the fund would cover not just minerals, but oil and gas and infrastructure facilities connected to minerals, but not exclusive to. So in other words, all potentially of Ukraine's infrastructure. So this is like it's an extortion. It's essentially the United
deal they
States
can't
saying,
refuse, isn't it?
And Ukraine gets not a penny in share until they've paid $100 billion to America, which is America's estimate. Yes, that's the real estimate of what they've put in. I mean, Trump was saying $350 billion. That was ridiculous. It was about $100 billion. Is the amount of money that the Americans have put into Ukraine since 2022. And the Americans are saying, you pay us back that $100 billion first, and then we'll split it with you 50-50. But we have total control over it. Now, that's not even constitutional, because this would have to go to the Parliament, the Rada. The Rada would not agree it. I can guarantee the Rada would not agree it. So maybe it's designed to be rejected so that Ukraine can be blamed for the breakdown of the peace talks and so on. If it were accepted, it's akin to somebody stealing a man's wallet while he was on the floor fighting off a couple of thugs who were trying to kill him. It's complete extortion. Yeah. And nobody who's looked at it independently has got a word to say in favour of it. It is simply a maximalist demand to drain as much money out of Ukraine without giving them anything. No security guarantees, nothing. Just the idea that, well, Americans will be involved in while we fleece you, while we take all your money, we'll be involved in your country. There's a security guarantee.
But is that gangsterish thing, isn't it? It's an offer they can't refuse. It's completely got them
they think they've got Ukrainians over a barrel.
Yeah.
That's why I think that's where we're heading for a parting of the ways. My guess is, and obviously I'm guessing, I think Ukraine will have to reject this deal. The Americans will then blame Ukraine for the continuation of the war. The Europeans will then have to decide, are they going to support Ukraine in continuing the war when the Americans say, stop supporting them? Ukraine has got to take the beating that they deserve from the Russians because they won't be reasonable. And you Europeans have got to stop helping them. It's time for the Ukrainians to take a beating. That's where I think we will be before the end of this year, maybe before the autumn.
Well, look, Mark has just asked, in sort of response to what you said, Michael, that if this is extortion, how can Europe stand by and let it happen? Because it will leave Ukraine's economy on its knees.
Yeah, it's parting of the ways. So far, what we've said is, look, with you Europeans, we support the idea of a ceasefire. Through gritted teeth, but it is it's probably the best option for this year, given that the United States won't continue to support the war effort for Ukraine. So we support the ceasefire, and we'll do what we can when we see what this deal might look like. But the ceasefire is getting further and further away, as we all thought it probably would. And at some point, this European support of the United States' line then becomes divergent to say, well, all these preparations we've done for boots on the ground and staff talks amongst our militaries will serve the same purpose if we decide that we've got to help Ukraine, which is where we're coming to a fundamental staring into our souls in Europe. I mean, at the point at which the Trump administration, if they stay on this path, they may not, but if they stay on this path, it will be to say, a plague on both your houses, we're out of here. We'll let the Russians win, and we don't care. And then when they tell the Europeans we're going to, the Americans will say, we'll pull all of our intelligence and all of our help to Ukraine that makes so much of a difference. We'll turn off Starlink. Are the Europeans going to say, okay, well, there's nothing we can do. It's tragic, but there it is. Or are they going to say, no, we'll do what we can to keep Ukraine going? And that will be a pretty fundamental moment in transatlantic relations.
It certainly will be, as you say, we're on the path towards that now, aren't we, Michael? And every time we have this...
Things may change. I don't want to be too gloomy about this, but the road we're on is leading to this crossroads, and this crossroads is coming to us in the next 3 months.
And we talk about this, and my question is always, when can Europe be in a position to do what it needs to do without the Americans there? And you have an idea of sort of time frame in your head. Don't you?
If we embrace the challenge fully, and meaningfully, by we I mean those European countries who've got the capacity to do it, which is not all 32 members of NATO for sure, or all 30 members of the European NATO. But if you embrace the 15 or 16 nations who could do it, it could be done within, say, 4 or 5 years. It could certainly be done within 10 years. Can't be done within 2 years. But you could put yourself on the road to begin to do it immediately. But you've got to get through the next 2 to 3 years. But
they're on the road now, aren't they, Michael? I mean, all these agreements that have been made, this coalition of the willing, constant meetings.
It is. But in terms of material, I mean, getting stuff made, produced. Has our government embraced it? Yes, it has. Is there a plan? Yes, there is. We haven't seen it yet, but we will see it sooner rather than later, and I think probably before the NATO summit on the 20th of June. So yes, we have a plan. And when will that plan pay off? It'll start to pay off quite quickly, I guess, I'm guessing. But it'll be 2 to 5 years before we see any real benefits, and 5 to 10 years before it makes a structural difference to our defence.
Necessitates that they get on with it now, but I mean, many will have said that they should.
The time to start was yesterday.
Yeah, man. Should have been getting on with it for quite some time, as I said to you. I think this first few weeks after the invasion began. All right, let's move on to a question from Lobo now. Is there concern behind closed doors that China, the US and Russia could agree to let each other take Taiwan, Greenland and the rest of Ukraine without interference from one another?
I'm sure there hasn't been a discussion. I'm sure there isn't an agreement. If this was a Hollywood film, the people would be sitting around in a sort of shaded room and talking quietly about it. That's what would happen in Hollywood. In the real world, no, that hasn't happened. But do all three countries anticipate that that is the road that they're on, that is the nature of their politics? Yeah, they do. So Putin made statements which said, look, of course the United States is interested in Greenland because it's interested in the Arctic, just the way we are. And the Russians, of course, they're interested in Panama. We would be in the same situation. I mean, Putin isn't saying he approves of it, but he's not disapproving either, because, I mean, Trump's interest in Greenland is on a par with Putin's obsession with Ukraine and Xi Jinping's obsession with Taiwan. And so essentially all three powers now recognize that they're all on land acquisition. They're all into land acquisition. So the Chinese are determined to take Taiwan, and their anaconda strategy, I call it the anaconda strategy, is already in place. They're already trying to squeeze it. The carrier, the Shandong, is at sea now, just off Taiwan. First time that's happened inside, more or less, inside the sort of the median line waters. The Chinese are already demonstrating that they can squeeze Taiwan. They're already starting to do that. And they want to take the South China Sea as well. So they've got territorial ambitions there. Putin's got ambitions in Ukraine, in Moldova, quite likely in the Baltics, and maybe in Scandinavia. We know all about that. And the United States has clearly, explicitly now got ambitions on Greenland, quite likely Panama, and maybe not Canada. And so all three nations are communicating to each other that they are imperial powers who are going to behave in an imperialist way. They don't need a Hollywood-style meeting to say that to each other. They've said it to each other in speeches and statements and behaviour.
And they'll support each other in the way that's necessary and fit.
Well, they'll tolerate each other doing it. They'll tolerate each other doing it.
The historical sort of echoes for Taiwan and for Russia we've discussed. What is the historical tie for Trump to try and get Greenland now? Is there one, or is it something?
Oh no, it goes back. No, I mean there are a couple of elements in this. I mean, one is the United States has looked at Greenland in the 19th century. It looked at it again in the Second World War. I mean, it actually did occupy Greenland in the Second World War, and nobody minded, because when the Nazis took over Denmark, the fear was, well, Greenland might become an outpost of some sort of operation. So the best way is to take it over, and nobody minded. So they did take it over, and in 1946, I think it was, Harry Truman's president talked to Denmark about wouldn't it be a good idea. So there's quite a lot of background in this in terms of thinking about it. And it would make perfect strategic sense for the United States to have control over Greenland security. The fact is, they've already got it. Everything that Trump says he wants is already his. There is a treaty between Denmark and the United States which allows the base at Pitufik, which is Thule. All my life it's been known as Thule, but now it's Pitufik, as a space base. It's the American Air Base. Yep. There used to be 10,000 troops there, or 10,000 personnel. There's now about 200. But, I mean, they could, using Pitufik, they could have as many troops as they want in Greenland. They could build stuff in Greenland. They could partner with Greenland for the resources.
Right, so they could extract the resources.
They could do all of that. Right. All that Trump says he wants is available to him now. So his arguments are strategic, but his motive is grandeur. He wants it added to the map. He wants it in the same colour as the United States, so that he can say, I, Donald Trump, just like President McKinley, who I so much admire at the turn of the century, who got the American empire in the Caribbean and in Guam and so on. I, President Trump, have actually enlarged the space of the United States. He doesn't need to do anything different to have what he says he wants. But what he really wants is the grandeur of it.
Could he stop ships going around if he wanted to, in this current position? Because there's some of that, isn't there? Because the sea lanes are going to open up
They are, yes.
And that's part of it too.
But I mean, again, you can do that under present arrangements. I mean, within NATO, NATO's got a good policy or developed policy on the high north and the Arctic, and there are plenty of partners to work with. I mean, this is the stupid thing about it. Everything that Trump says he must have, Mr. President, you've already got it. Why don't you just use it? But of course, that's the point. It still won't be America. That's what he really wants.
He wants that big island. Fair enough. All right, look, Addy P has got a question here, and this is something actually you've talked about a few times, Michael, about Donald Trump losing patience. Had reports this week that he's losing patience with Putin. What did he say? He was pissed off about some of the deals that hadn't been done. Do you ever see a scenario in which Trump visits Russia to talk to Putin face to face? Talk to us a bit about him losing the patience and then the idea of the two men meeting and hashing things out.
Well, he said he's losing patience, and I'm sure he has to say that, because otherwise it really does look as if he's being manipulated by this man in the Kremlin. And what he's going to do about it, we don't know. But so far, it's still the case that carrots and sticks, all the sticks have been applied to Ukraine and all the carrots are being applied to Russia. Now, when he said he's losing patience, that was when he implied he might use sanctions. And there was some talk then of secondary sanctions and maybe sanctions on Russia's oil trade, oil and gas. So that's a possibility. Mm-hmm. But would he go and meet Putin? At some point, I'm sure he will. And that will be his big sort of era-defining summit. But he won't go and meet him, I think, in the near future. It'll be a phone call. But at some point, he may come to the point where he's got to say, look, I have got to talk to Putin. And Putin, believe me, will have all his replies ready. And Putin will appear to be flexible, and still the thing won't move forward very far. What Putin's trying to do, fairly obviously, is maneuver Trump into the position where Trump blames Europe and Ukraine for the continuation of the war. And they're fairly successfully doing that at the moment. Whether they can continue to do it, I mean, whether the Russians will continue on this line, we don't know. But it all depends on Trump's psychology, really. And Trump's not going to stick with this forever. As I think we said before, Kamali, if once this ceasefire starts to just unravel completely, or becomes an impossibility, Trump will just move on. He'll just move to the next issue. And so the ceasefire will just be one of the things that doesn't happen, in the same way that the Riviera on the Mediterranean, Gaza, doesn't happen. It just goes into the long grass. It's one of those things that was talked about and move on. He's moved on. That's what I suspect he will do.
To the complete detriment of Ukraine and the rest of the world.
It would be, yeah, it would be. But a Putin summit is very much in his mind, but probably not over the ceasefire, because it won't go very well. It'll be phone calls over the ceasefire, and then it'll be a summit, maybe later in the year or even next year.
Well, there's the invite to go in May, wasn't it? That we talked
That's
about
right. We talked
ago.
about it. I mean, it would be very foolish for him to go now unless they can seal a meaningful ceasefire deal, which I don't think they will.
They probably could just and then do something in May.
No, maybe things would have to change on the ground quite a lot. Quite a lot. But what he wants is the summit, which is the big strategic partnership summit, which is much more about economics and energy than it is about Ukraine.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to a question here from Stephen, and it's about Russia and the threats to attack the UK. Stephen says he's stressed and he's scared, and if they did, would we get any warning? Well, Stephen,
it's already happening in the way that the British intelligence defines a below the sub-strategic level, or sub-threshold. And so we're subject to daily cyber attacks, we're subject to sabotage, we're subject to interference in all ways. Undoubtedly, the Russians have got Britain in the crosshairs. When they get finished with Ukraine, in their view, when they get a break from fighting in Ukraine, they really do want to pinpoint Britain, because they perceive that we're isolated from our European partners. Whether that's right or not, that's what they think. And that we're not as close to America as we'd like to be. And if they could make an example of us, if they could actually hurt Britain, it would have a chilling effect on the other European powers, who would see what we can do to Britain, so behave yourselves. That's the fear. And so Britain's got to become much more resilient. If it's entirely likely that we will be subjected to much more serious cyber attacks, and that our public services would be subject to these attacks. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are on behalf of other actors who are encouraged by the Russians. Ransomware attacks are very popular now. And although they are about ransom, but they're actually about disruption as far as the Kremlin is concerned. If somebody can make money out of doing it as well, that's fine. And we know that our public services and our utilities are not well protected in a cyber sense. Our cyber defences are scrambling all the time to meet the challenges challenges that they face on a daily basis. There's no secret about that. Parliament's been onto it. Committees that I've been working for are onto it, have produced report after report about how vulnerable we are. And sure enough, yes, we are. So we are going to suffer that sort of sub-threshold pressure, which will probably increase. Would the Russians launch attacks on us directly? Not in present circumstances. Would they launch them against British bases abroad? Possibly, depending on the crisis, like Cyprus, like bases in Cyprus or British forces abroad. Would they take direct responsibility? Probably not. They'd get somebody else to do it. Would we get into a shooting war with Russia? Probably not at the moment. But we're on a track where we will find ourselves confronting the Russians over the various ways in which they're cutting our pipelines, trying to interfere with our normal way of life, and frighten us. They're trying to put pressure on us to frighten us.
And Stephen's final point here, would we get any warnings? It's a question I often ask you. And we have some way of knowing where Russia's, use the nuclear word here, but where their nuclear weapons are and what state of readiness they're at.
Yeah, we'd certainly know about that. I mean, you would see that crisis coming for sure. And you'd see a crisis of more conventional military power coming. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be any sort of military attack on the United Kingdom as such, but it might be on our interests, it might be on our shipping, it might be, as I say, it might be on our bases. And you would see that you'd see the danger of it building up. But it'd be a danger to several things, not just to the United Kingdom, but it'd be a danger to other things as well. Most important thing here is that Britain stays close to its NATO allies.
Even
Britain,
America?
Well, it's NATO allies in Europe. We'd like to stay close to America, but America is leaving us, it seems. But we really want to stay close, much closer than we have been recently, to France, to Germany as it rethinks its defence, to our friends in the Scandinavian countries, the Baltics, in Northern Europe, Denmark, Netherlands. These are really important countries to us, and we need to get closer to them so that we face the threats of the future together, because, believe me, together we're a lot stronger than separately.
Absolutely. We've got a few more questions to get through. We've got a bit more time, Michael, if you'll indulge us for a few more. What are this kind of follows on from this. What are the British military's biggest problems and what are its greatest strengths right now? That is from Alexander.
That's good. Well, greatest strengths, I would say that the greatest strength is its professionalism. The British military is very professional and it's supported by society. I mean, the British military is pretty popular in Britain, and that's not the case in most other countries. A lot of countries are very wary of their militaries because at some time in the past their militaries have been used against the civilian population. I mean, the military in Germany is German public opinion has a very ambiguous attitude towards the German military because of its not so recent, not so distant past. Whereas in Britain, so the military is popular. It's very professional. The weaknesses or the problems are, I guess, they're twofold in a way. The one obvious one, you'd expect me to say money, and that's a given. They've been run down in the last 20, 25 years. But there's two problems. One is that what we have in the shop window is pretty good. Ships, tanks and planes and the people who operate them, as it were, attract a lot of good comment. I mean, we have world-class forces, but it's all in the shop window. There's nothing else there. So you've got to take it out of the window to use it, and if you lose it, then nothing gets replaced.
That's a problem.
That's a problem. So we've only got what we've got in the shop window, even though the shop window is very good. So sustainability is the one thing.
Is there a big shop window?
Pardon?
Is there big shop windows?
Well, it's changing. That was going to be my second point in a way. What we have in the window is about to change. It's transformative. So we are embarked on transforming our armed forces towards more drones, more robots, ships without crews, robot ships, robot aircraft, robot tanks, electronic warfare, the ability to unite the domains of warfare. You make war in air, land and sea, space and cyber. Those are the 5 big domains of warfare: air, land, sea, space and cyber. And if you can integrate what you do in all those domains, then you can do it very, very efficiently with relatively small physical forces. So the shop window, we've got to have more behind the shop window, but the shop window's got to start to look different. Not full of ships, tanks and planes, but full of things, some ships, tanks and planes, but some of the things that you wouldn't even know you were looking at. Some strange devices, strange electronic things, strange robots that don't look like a weapon, but actually turn out to be extremely useful. That's the challenge: transformation and sustainability. And we're on that road. To say there is a plan. We haven't seen it yet, but there is a plan, and we will see it before too long.
Strategic Defence Review is due to come this year, next few?
For sure. This year. I mean, my guess is it'll be before the NATO summit, because it'd be daft to go to the NATO summit without having revealed the plan that we know has been written. And it's waiting. Something else has been written in the Ministry of Defence at the moment, the National Security Review, which is a separate document, and they're waiting for that, I think, to put it with the Defence Review, is my understanding. And both of those, I'm fairly sure, would have to come out before the summit.
And George Robertson's leading it, right? I mean,
he led the review.
You know the man?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, he led the review along with General Richard Barrons, and Fiona Hill, the academic who worked for the Trump administration, British academic in the States. The National Security Review is being led by John Bew, the academic who is at King's College, who was involved in the government's previous integrated review. Again, very high quality character. So all of that work, I mean, quite a lot of that work is now done, is my understanding. Yeah. Some of it is still to be done through John Bew's work. When that's finished, I'm sure the two documents will then be released more or less together, maybe on the same day. And I'd be amazed if we waited until after the NATO summit, because it'd be foolish to send the Prime Minister to a summit without our blueprint for what we're going to do in the future.
Absolutely. All right. Michael, final question then. I think this is one that's quite useful for me to get and for our viewers to get from you. Through the past few weeks, how has your thinking about all of this process changed, if at all, when you've seen sort of the twists and turns from Trump? We've heard the words from Putin. Whereabouts are you with this now in terms of the realistic chance of this war stopping soon?
There's a lot of headlines at the moment. Say 10 weeks that changed the world. There was a famous book in 1919 by John Reed, the American John Reed, called 10 Days That Changed the World, about the Russian Revolution, which he witnessed in 1917. And a lot of headlines now, 10 weeks that changed the world since the inauguration of Donald Trump. And that's where we are, to change the world. And the war in Ukraine is now going to be a casualty in one form or another of these changes that have taken place in these tumultuous 10 weeks that we've talked about in the last few weeks that we've been having these sessions. Before the inauguration of President Trump, all the analysts were thinking, now what will it mean? And we had a sort of a clapometer, that started at one end of the worst end of the scale, and went to the best end of the scale. And we thought, well, where will it fix? It'll sort of move around, and it'll shiver, and it'll fix somewhere around that. Well, it started at the worst end and got a bit worse than worst. So it's a bit worse than we thought the worst would be.
Worse than where you thought it was going to be?
Yeah.
Because which parts of it particularly?
Just the speed with which the United States wants to detach itself from Europe, the speed with which it wants to punish Ukraine for trying to defend itself. And although that's not completely fixed yet, I mean, as we keep saying, Trump can change his mind, as he does on many things. The further we've gone on in these weeks, the more Ukraine has been the victim of American thinking, which is on a different level. And so the United States is determined, it seems, under Trump, to create this triumvirate of imperial powers that we've just talked about, Russia, China, and America. And if he'd been paying attention to what is happening in Africa and the Middle East and Latin America and Asia, he would see that American power is draining away. I mean, in a sense, American and Western power was diminishing anyway, a bit like water in a bath, that we're slopping over the top and we were losing it. But in the last 10 weeks, as if somebody's pulled the plug from the bath, and instead of slopping over the top and losing it now here and there, we're losing it now centrally. The centre of the Western world is draining influence away, while Donald Trump pursues this mega idea of the big three powers sorting out their problems together. And that's where we are. It's a very, very difficult time. And the rest of us now, and you can see this in the Korean Peninsula, you see it with South Korea, you see it with Japan, you see it with African states, South Africa, you see it in Europe. Everyone is now saying, okay, what does the world look like without American support, without American interest even with American hostility to things that we used to think were a shared interest. So now we're all rethinking a very different multipolar world.
Very, very different space, profound new world, and we'll answer some of those questions, I think, next week. Michael, always good to talk with you, as always, and thank you all very much for being with us for this week's Ukraine Q&A, Professor Michael Clarke, and we'll do another one next week. You up for that? Good stuff. Thank you all for being with us.